Yeah, and then the other side of that was kindness and interest. That's exactly what the panel was saying about being nice and being tolerant, being respectful. This is the capacity for empathy and relating well to others. So there's these two sides to the skill development with mindfulness. And yes, there are a range of activities, if you like, involved with that, and one of those is often called mindful breathing, or it could be called meditation, but there's many other activities as well that we teach in the Pause, Breathe, Smile program that we operate.
So, I mean, Nigel Ladders, he's a huge fan. He said, look, if there was one thing for New Zealand's future, it would be for mindfulness to be taught in schools.
Yes.
Does it work? Is it
sure does.
Is it not just a fad?
Fortunately not. We're up to about 40 years now of clinical research around the world, and we're 6 years into research in New Zealand on the Pause, Breathe, Smile program. We were delighted to have the opportunity to share the Pause, Breathe, Smile program with Nigel. He saw it in action in a school in Auckland who have been running the program for a few years, and he could see straight away that the kids really got it. The teachers actually too, just to respond to one of the things that the panel said, they learn the program alongside the children, and teacher wellbeing is a focus of the professional development we provide, because we're very conscious of the overwhelm and the overload on teachers. And so we get a lot of feedback from principals who are thrilled that the program relates to the teachers as well as the kids. So the research that we've seen in New Zealand around Pause, Breathe, Smile, and that's been done by University of Auckland and AUT. There's 3 published studies now, plus some more informal evaluation, and that shows time and again these improvements in focus and attention for better learning, this readiness to learn that teachers love, more calm in the classroom, the decreasing anxiety. We're seeing the reduction in conflict, so they're increasing their conflict resolution skills, better pro-social behaviour, so that's the anti-bullying coming through.
Oh, yes.
And overall, statistically significant increases in wellbeing, which is key for this time in our lives.
Just finally,
actually measurable wellbeing.
Yeah, just finally, and briefly before you leave us, Natasha, so how do the children respond to mindfulness?
They actually really take to it really well. So I have a quote here from one teacher who said, "The children have just taken this totally beyond my expectations." She was concerned at first that they wouldn't be into it, and she was delighted to find that the children had changed these attitudes, and it astounded her that not even one child is disengaged. Okay. So we've got over 1,200 teachers around New Zealand now teaching this program, and schools come back to train more new staff. So it's definitely working, and the kids enjoy it. They do it at home. They share it with their families.
Natasha Ricks, Director of the Mindfulness Education Group there, part of the Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand. Jana in the control room says, actually I have a gun amp and it's great. So there you go. Hot cake pedals too are very, very good. But Michael says, Wallace, I so agree with you. Jansen amps are toneless compared to Fenders because of the saturation of the cheap New Zealand iron and the output transformers. So there you go, in education.
Well, hang on, I'll put another plug for New Zealand amps then. If we're talking about guitar amps, then I've got a 45-year-old Elron amp that was made by
Elron.
And that's it's just had a birthday, some new pots and some new capacitors, and it's sounding sweet.
Have you heard of Perot amps?
Yes, absolutely.
Apparently, Perot, New Zealand made. The big deal, the owner of Perot amps rolled a Perot amp, clunk, 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 onto a Deep Purple stage, and Deep Purple were blown away. A New Zealand-made amp, and Deep Purple loved them.
I rate Perot better than Plinius.
There you go. Gosh, you and I, Chris, have to have a beer over amps, eh? Darwin, do you want to come along?
Sure, I'll come along.
Darwin Stewart, Chris Wakata, been fantastic. See you tomorrow.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. On tonight's programme, graffiti-style industrial slogans chalked on St John ambulances. Is it distressing and disrespectful to the donors, or fair game in the fight for fair pay? A lawyer representing Pike River families says he's disturbed that evidence from the mine appears to have gone missing. And an Auckland man who fractured his jaw when he was bucked off an allegedly faulty Lime scooter wants the whole fleet taken off the roads until they're fixed. Forget the market. These little cooney pigs went walkabout in a New Plymouth neighbourhood. Now they're looking for someone to bust them out of the pound. Butchers need not apply. RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leia tawa tēnei. The government says multinational companies doing business in this country are not paying their fair share of tax, and it plans to change the rules to make them do so. The Finance Minister Grant Robertson and the Revenue Minister Stuart Nash says Cabinet has agreed to issue a discussion document on updating the tax framework. Without naming Google or Facebook, Mr Robertson says highly digitalised companies, such as those offering social media networks and trading platforms, earn a significant income from New Zealand consumers without being liable for income tax. He says that's not fair, and the government is determined to do something about it. Mr Robertson says the current tax rules also provide a competitive advantage to foreign companies in the digital services field compared to local companies offering similar services. The Prime Minister says New Zealand is going through the same process as the United Kingdom in considering a bid by Huawei to be involved in the rollout of 5G. Britain's National Cyber Security Centre has reportedly concluded the risks of using the Chinese company's equipment in its 5G networks can be contained. New Zealand Spy Agency recommended rejecting a similar bid here unless Spark proved it could mitigate similar risks. Jacinda Ardern says the two countries' processes are similar in this regard.
We have a process where an assessment is made by the GCSB, independent of ministers. Any vendor who's made an application is then told the outcome of that assessment and is given the chance, if there are security concerns, to mitigate those concerns. That is exactly where we are now. Spark has been given options around mitigation of potential security concerns, and now the ball is in their court.
Jacinda Ardern speaking after today's Cabinet meeting. Australia's Prime Minister says the country's three major political parties were targeted in a cyber attack by a foreign government earlier this month. Speaking in Parliament a short time ago, Scott Morrison confirmed the results of an investigation into a security breach involving Parliament House's computer servers.
During the course of this work, we also became aware that the networks of some political parties, Liberal, Labor and Nationals, have also been affected. But our cyber experts believe that a sophisticated state actor is responsible for this malicious activity.
Scott Morrison says there is no evidence of electoral interference, but steps have been taken to ensure the integrity of Australia's electoral system. The Commerce Commission has hit a hurdle in its fight against the controversial ticket reseller Viagogo. It has been seeking an interim injunction to stop the website from committing what it says are further breaches of the Fair Trading Act. It gets more complaints about Viagogo than the next two most complained about traders combined. Our arts and entertainment reporter Katie Scotcher explains.
In a just-released High Court judgment, Justice Courtney has ruled that the action can't proceed because there is no jurisdiction for doing so. She says she's dismissing the application for the injunction because Viagogo has not yet been formally served. An attempt to serve a formal injunction notice was made to the website, but Viagogo insisted it had to be served in its jurisdiction of Switzerland, not in New Zealand. The company was aware of the High Court proceedings. Ko Katie Scotcher aho.
News just to hand, one person has been taken to hospital following a chlorine spill at a school in Thames. Fire and Emergency says five crews are at a Parawai primary school. The Corrections Minister, Kelvin Davies, says no one should be fired because the chair of a corrections forum called Māori nationalist groups a potential threat to public safety. In newly released minutes from a Department of Corrections meeting, the groups are listed as a danger to the public, alongside jihadi and violent political groups. Mr Davies says that while the comment is disappointing, no one should be fired for a one-off comment.
I'm certain that it's not going to happen again. Corrections know that that's the way this government thinks. They do have a job in making sure that our communities are safe, but certainly using the terminology, the words and identifying Māori was totally inappropriate.
Kelvin Davis. Corrections says it has no evidence of any Māori nationalist groups imprisoned. It's 5:05. The Education Ministry and teacher unions enter mediation this week in an attempt to settle stalled pay talks and head off possible strikes. Members of the Secondary Teachers Union had been poised to strike this term, and primary teachers and principals had been expected to vote on whether they would hold a third strike. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
The Educational Institute is reopening talks with the ministry through mediated bargaining tomorrow, and the Post-Primary Teachers Association says its recent negotiations will enter mediation this week. Both unions' members last year rejected the ministry's offers of 3% pay rises. They wanted a better pay increase and better working conditions, including more time for planning. But the government has insisted it will not add any more money, leaving the ministry to rejig its existing offers. Ko John Gerritsen TNA.
The police dive squad is on its way to a crash site where a truck was found in a river on State Highway 2 in Eastern Bay of Plenty. The police say they were notified that a truck and trailer unit was in the river near Toon and Ruatuna roads in Waiotahi around 11 o'clock this morning. At last report, the truck and its driver were still in the water. To sport now, and the former All Blacks winger Julian Savea is refusing to walk away from French club Toulon. Club owner Mourad Boudjala has told French media that Savea has been released and isn't welcome in Toulon anymore. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
Julian Savea has hit back at Mourad Boudjala on social media, saying even if he's not welcome at the club, he still has a year to run on his contract and he'll continue to turn up to training. Boudjala, a comic book magnate with a reputation for lashing out at players in the media, has been unimpressed with Savea's impact at the club, where he scored just 1 try in 11 games. He suggested that he'll ask for a DNA test, saying the real Julian Savea never turned up at the club. Some French media have also suggested Savea's being made a scapegoat for the underperforming side, which is in danger of missing out on the top 14 playoffs and a spot in the European Champions Cup. This is Stephen Hewson.
Re-signing with the Crusaders won't stop Scott Robertson from becoming All Blacks coach. Robertson has re-signed for the 2020 and 2021 seasons, but has also indicated he's keen to replace Steve Hansen when he steps down from the All Blacks job after this year's World Cup. Under New Zealand rugby policy, coaches aren't able to coach the All Blacks and a Super Rugby side at the same time, and Robertson has made it clear to the Crusaders he'll be applying for the top job later in the year, which could leave the defending Super Rugby champions looking for a new coach in 2020. And the former Newcastle defender Stephen Taylor has signed with the Wellington Phoenix football side for a further season. That's the news.
The dangers of fighting fires.
So you're hanging out the door. You can't drop the water where the smoke is. You've got to drop the water on the actual flames.
A missing clue from the Pike River blast.
Quite frankly, looking for an ignition source or a reason why Pike River blew up. It's like looking for a needle in a pile of needles.
And hosing down hotspots in the National Party.
You can have all the views you want. Here's the deal. I'm confident and comfortable in my leadership.
Settle in with us. Morning Report, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, the Ombudsman uses his powers to investigate the standard of dementia care and of other vulnerable groups. And after 10, Fiona Wall and Annie O'Neill celebrate 3 decades of Pacific and Māori creatives. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, cloudy periods with isolated showers until evening and again from tomorrow afternoon. For the remainder of the North Island, fine, apart from areas of morning and evening cloud. Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud tomorrow evening. Bulla, cloudy periods with a few showers from tomorrow afternoon. Westland and Fiordland, rain spreading north today with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms south of the glaciers from tonight. Canterbury, fine with high cloud increasing this afternoon and a few spots of rain in the south until tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, scattered light rain, more persistent for a time tomorrow morning, becoming widespread tomorrow evening with heavy falls possible in Southland. And the Chatham Islands, a few showers developing this evening, possibly heavy with thunderstorms, clearing tomorrow but remaining cloudy. It's 9 minutes past 5.
And this is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Ambulance paramedics are being warned they're offending charitable donors by scrawling graffiti on St John ambulances as part of a pay dispute. First Union says wage negotiations have stalled, leaving them no choice but to protest in this way. And the slogans are written in washable liquid chalk and don't include offensive language. St John says the protest is costing it and it's had formal complaints from donors. I asked First Union organiser Sarah Stone what she would say to people who might be upset that ambulances they've helped fund are being defaced in this way.
Well, I know that workers wouldn't want to offend anyone who's particularly people who are giving donations, and often those donations are an attribute to someone who's now passed. So that is certainly not our intention. Our intention is to gain more public attention, which we've seemed to have managed, and to try and get St John and the current Minister of Health to listen to the situation that we're in now.
I know it's not your intention to offend, but St John's says that they have received formal complaints from donors and supporters. So you are offending, aren't you?
Well, I guess if the message from our workers is that they're not being paid for their night work, they're not being paid for their weekend work, and for an increasing portion of them now, they're finding the job unsustainable. And what we hear back from St John, and we hear it back every single time, is, oh, we don't have the money, we didn't budget for the money, we can't give you a pay rise this time. But don't worry, we'll do that next time. And members have got to the point where it just can't continue.
So what are you saying, Sarah? Desperate times, so you take desperate measures, whether some people may be offended or not?
Yeah, I think that's what we've come to. We've come to taking this drastic action because 2 weeks of mediated meetings, and we're not progressing to the point that we want. St John's last offer was worse than previous offers, and we're here. It's Groundhog Day again. We're here. We're in bargaining, and yet again, nothing's being budgeted for. The workers won't get a decent pay rise. They're expected to provide a 24/7 service, and that's not what they're getting. That's not what's being recognised.
I want to get to some of the details of what you're asking for in a moment, but just set out for us, what boundaries have you placed on messages? What kind of messages have been written on the ambulances, and where exactly?
The messages are primarily on the windows or on the bodywork. We have sent out instructions on 2 or 3 occasions to members. In the beginning, we had some suggestions for messages, but members are free to make their own as long as they're in line with our campaign. There's a lot of messages saying, revive my pay, or my pay needs, it doesn't need first aid, it needs CPR. Shift our pay is our campaign message. Messages to David Clark, the current House Minister. All along those lines, really. Of some of them are more humorous, where they say, "Oh, you must have seen terrible things." Yeah, my pay packet.
So
nothing obscene, no obscene drawings, right. No obscene,
and nothing on the inside of the ambulance that patients who are in distress or receiving medical treatment on the inside of the ambulance would be looking at.
No, when we issued the strike notice, it was for any part of the vehicle, but delegates and members decided that patients were in a vulnerable position inside the ambulance, and therefore it wasn't appropriate to have messaging inside. So it's only on the outside of the vehicle.
Some people would argue it's inappropriate on the outside as well. It just looks unprofessional and a bit shabby.
Well, I think that's how St John workers feel they're being treated. They're being treated in a shabby way, and if there's any damage to the service, it's St John and David Clark. Both David Clark and St John use the language around productivity. If the wages want a pay rise, then we're going to have to look at what they can do to get more money. And these are workers who haven't had a decent pay rise in years. They work 12-hour shifts. It's a language of commerce. It's not the language of wellness, and we're at an impasse.
So, on average, what would these ambulance paramedics be being paid? Give me a bracket from what to what?
From a starting rate would be for an assistant, and these are this was part of the double crewing project, and they would start at 41,000, just over actually 41,700. But if you've been a paramedic, an intensive care paramedic, and you've been in the profession for 10 years plus, you'd be on 83,000.
Because that sounds kind of comparable with nurses. So ambulance paramedics worth more than nurses, do you think?
I don't think it's a question of we're worth more than them. I think for this group of workers, the message that they're getting is they're not even worth the same. So nurses get paid for night work, they get paid for weekend work. And this is the only group of people left now in the health sector that aren't rewarded for doing those shifts. So cleaners get paid for it, orderlies get paid for it, nurses, doctors, but only St John workers don't get paid for it.
So what are you after? Because there was an offer of 2.5% on the table and more for those workers getting paid the least. So what will fix this for you?
Penal rate shift pay will fix this for us. We've asked to do a workforce review where we look at the scope of the job, because the scope has changed so much for an ambulance officer. So it used to be that maybe the role was more of a caretaking, first aid role, transporting someone to the hospital, and now you can deliver controlled drugs. You might be required to drill into someone's bones. You might be required to put someone in a drug-induced coma, an intensive care paramedic, and only doctors and hospitals can do that at the moment.
You have singled out obviously the health minister and also St John's, because it's run partly on charity. I think the split is about 70-30, isn't it? 70% money comes from the government, about 30% from charity. I mean, who's responsible then, the charity or the government? Who's supposed to stump up with the money?
Well, I would say they're both responsible. I mean, what we've heard from Peter Bradley is that he hasn't counted in, he hasn't factored in pay rises.
So this is the CEO, so people know. This is the CEO of St John's, right? And what is he not doing in your view?
He's not asking. He's always got the amount of money that he's asked for. They've always got the exact amount they ask for from the government, and so they just simply don't ask enough. And when we come round into bargaining, every single time they say, next time we'll get it for you. And then you've got a health minister who, the government at the moment saying they want to deliver a wellness budget, and then you've got these workers who are at the front line of delivering wellness. And then David Clark, the current health minister, saying, oh, well, if they're a little bit more productive, maybe we could... He's saying he won't put any more money in this budget. He said he won't release any more money for the next budget, but to come back when he's in government for the second term. And our members can't survive that long.
So what next? If graffiti on ambulances doesn't work, what next?
Well, we have actions ready to start balloting on, further actions, and we'll just have to start increasing those. But this is not the way we want to go. We want to settle this dispute, and we want to find a way that workers can stay in the jobs that they love and deliver that service to New Zealanders.
So that was Sarah Stone from First Union. We did ask St John to come on the program this evening, but they declined to be interviewed. They did give us a statement where they said they've asked union members to refrain from using materials which could cause permanent damage to the ambulances. They say the graffiti is causing increased distress to patients and families already in a vulnerable state. And these industrial actions and activities are also impacting St John financially, they say. They say that they've made an offer that they think is fair, given St John's current funding arrangements, and that is ahead of a full workforce review. St John has met with the Minister of Health to express concerns over the current funding arrangements, the statement says, which St John says is unsustainable. And in partnership with Wellington Free Ambulance, St John has asked for a significant increase in funding levels. It is 18 minutes after 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen to hear your feedback. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. And just one other piece of housekeeping. You can just listen to us on radio today. We're having some technical problems, so you can't watch, but we're still here, so stay tuned. An Auckland man who was catapulted 10 metres off a Lime scooter when it stopped suddenly wants them pulled from the road immediately.
Liam Thompson hopped on a Lime scooter on Friday evening and was on his way home from a nearby supermarket after picking up some food for his son's first birthday when he says the scooter malfunctioned. The accident's left him with a broken jaw, scrapes across his chest and wrist, and he's facing up to 6 weeks off work as he recovers. Mr Thompson says riders are playing Russian roulette with the e-scooters as there's no way of knowing which ones will seize up until it's too late. Our reporter Nita Blake-Person went to visit Liam at his home, where he explained how the accident happened as he was cradling his son Harvey.
It was around 5:30. I decided to shoot off to the supermarket to get some last-minute groceries and stuff like that for the boy and for his birthday. And then I walked up the road and I saw a Lime scooter there, sitting there, so I decided to jump on and just ride home. I was on the scooter for about 2 minutes, and then I was just riding down the path. All of a sudden, the wheel just locked up and I got thrown over the front and landed straight on my jaw, breaking it. I sat up, spat out a little blood and some teeth and walked on home and off to the hospital.
So would you take me through that moment of flying over the handlebars and whatever sounds or pain and what came next?
It went in a heartbeat. I was just going down the road thinking about the boy, and then next minute, just smack, I just flew off, hit the ground, slid across the ground and heard my skin rip off my chest, and sat up and just felt the soreness of my fingers and my wrists, and touched my chin and felt my chin just felt not right, just a bit mangled.
How far do you think you went flying when the wheels locked?
Oh, maybe about 5-10 metres. I was probably flying for about a second and I was probably on the floor for the rest of the time, sliding across.
You came home and eventually made it to the hospital. Yeah. What was their take when you got there?
Well, my partner dropped me off at the emergency line, and I just walked in and I said, my jaw is broken, and they couldn't understand me, and I just tried to speak clearly and tell them that my jaw had been broken, and they quickly got onto it and they thought my neck was broken, so I got right past the lines, straight into a bed.
And they went through, and obviously you've got all your grazes on whereabouts, your body, your wrists.
My chest and my wrists and a bit on my knee and my shoulders. Got a little bit there, and I'm lucky I didn't rip off my nipple. Just some small ones, but my chin mostly and under my neck. I got a few stitches in my chin. I'm very lucky that it wasn't my chin that broke, it was up the sides.
So 6 weeks you're on a liquid diet for that long?
Yep. Smoothies and soup.
The Lime scooter was just sitting there afterwards.
Yeah, I couldn't do much about it. I just left it there. I took a photo and gave him a 1-star rating and left. I was more worried about getting home.
And was there any indication about why it might have locked up?
No clue. I only realised that they were having malfunctions that day because I read up on it a little bit, but I didn't know they were having malfunctions beforehand, so I didn't think anything of it.
And was there any indication afterwards that Lime would do anything to take that scooter off the road, or where is it now?
None whatsoever. I wouldn't have a clue who's out there driving it around, and I hope no one has another accident because of it.
There was no warning, no, process for dealing with it afterwards.
I just had to look after myself pretty much. I've given them a message and an email, but I'll wait for the reply.
So that was Friday, and there's been no communication about a product which has left you unable to chew for 6 weeks, broken bones, bruised and grazed body.
I have no sick leave, no annual leave, so if I have any more time off, I don't get anything. And I would have taken full responsibility if I was playing around or if I was trying to do a jump or something silly or being on the road. But because I was trying to be safe, I was on the footpath, I was going slow, and it happened because of a malfunction. I mean, how could I possibly be at fault if I had no clue what was going to go and, what was going to happen?
I know in Switzerland, when this issue was happening, they took all of them off the roads. Is that appropriate here?
I guess so. Well, definitely if it's going to cause other people to hurt themselves, even though Lime knows exactly what's going on.
Do you think that the council, given that they've given them consent to be here, and they gave them consent to be here when they were functioning, now they're malfunctioning, they need to review their position on this?
Definitely. I think more testing should be gone, they should have a look at them a bit more, not just oh yeah, this one works, sweet, everyone should be fine. I should go through each and every one of them if it needs to be. I mean, anyone can jump on and anyone could hurt themselves. I mean, it could be anyone's son, anyone's mother, anyone's father. So if we could stop that or slow that down, you know, it's our community, we've got to look after ourselves.
They've told us that they are investigating the issue and all affected scooters will be taken off the road, but how do they know what the affected scooters are?
Exactly. I guess it's the ones that people complain about being damaged, but I haven't heard anything, or I don't know anything. It's just their word, I guess. But again, I haven't seen that. It's just what people have been saying.
And how much has this been disruptive to your life? I guess is the pain aspect as well.
Oh, I'm pretty good with the pain, but I do feel when I'm about to go to bed, I do relive a little bit of that fall in and crack in. I do have a bit of a jump in bed, realising that it has happened and how it has affected me. I'm a bit sore every day and I can't really lift much. I'm just broken, I guess. I'm going to be out of money quite a lot, so maybe a little bit of compensation would go a long way, and just to help me with my day-to-day activities.
Would you be concerned for other people getting on Lime scooters in the meantime?
Definitely, definitely.
What would be your message to them at the moment?
Well, it's hard to say drive safe because you can be the safest person in the world and the malfunction could mean that you're not at fault. But I guess just don't get on them until they're fixed, until we have guarantees.
And that was Liam Thompson, who was talking to Nita Blake-Person. You could hear his little son Harvey in the background. The accident that he had is the latest in a string of injuries caused by a suspected fault to the scooter's wheel locking system. In each case, riders have described coming to a complete stop mid-ride without any warning at all. In each case, They had no idea it was coming, basically. So what's happening, and are the scooters too dangerous to be on our roads? Well, joining us now is Auckland Council's Chief Operating Officer, Dean Kimpton. Hi, Dean. What has Lime told you about any faults with their scooters?
Look, thank you for the opportunity to talk this evening. First of all, before we get into Lime's response, very concerned about what happened to Liam and wish him all the best in his recovery. Lime has assured us, and they wrote to us a week ago, that safety is their first priority, that they are doing regular checks both in the warehouse and in the field on their scooters. They're monitoring feedback from customers and are available 24/7. So people have their own reaction to that and what their personal experience is. Prompted by Liam's experience over the weekend, we have also written to them again today and will follow up tomorrow seeking more detailed advice on what they're actually learning. Pardon me?
What have you said to them in that follow-up letter? You said you've sent as a result of seeing Liam's case. So what have you said to them in that letter?
I've asked them to provide detailed feedback on the assurances and the numbers of scooters that have been affected, with the objective of getting a better understanding of where they're at and what they're proposing. Has what they've proposed, is it actually having an effect in terms of scooter safety?
So have they given you any numbers at all in terms of the number of scooters that have this problem?
No, I haven't received any numbers yet, and that's why I've written to them today.
But so you have accepted their earlier assurances without seeing any numbers or any hard data on how widespread the problem is?
Well, we wrote to them a week ago on the 13th of February seeking their assurance that they had this issue under control. At that stage, I presume they weren't in a position to provide us numbers. My view is that they should be now, and they should be writing informing us without us having to write and ask them.
So did they assure you they had the situation under control?
What they assured us was that they had the right processes in place, that safety was their priority, and that they were doing regular checks, they're doing the monitoring of feedback, and they're available 24/7 to fix it up. But what we want on behalf of the public of Auckland, and certainly as the grantor of a licence, we want assurance that they're on top of the problem, they know the number of scooters that are affected, that they understand why we do have this glitch or bug in the scooter control system, and that they're addressing the problem. We're as worried about scooter safety as anybody.
Well, given that you don't have that data at the moment and there seems to be a paucity of information, why not take all the scooters off the road until you can be assured that this problem is under control?
All options are on the table, and we're in a trial period. We'll take an escalated approach on this. So the first step was tell us what assurances you've got in place. Second step is we expect now to get some more detailed information about numbers and have they resolved the issue. If worst comes to worst and we have to ask them to take all scooters off the roads because we can't be assured and we've got an ongoing unacceptable incident rate, then of course we'll be able to do that under the licence.
So you're leaving that option on the table?
Well, all options are on the table at this stage because we're in a trial period. We also want to understand how to manage these because a lot of Aucklanders have actually enjoyed riding scooters.
But what would it take?
We've seen that in the numbers, and we're trying to balance. We're not compromising safety, so not balancing safety with other outcomes, but we are trying to make sure that we understand how to manage this from a safety, but also a public access to micro forms of transport around Auckland. And so there's a few things that we're wanting to look at.
And I understand that, but what we're kind of trying to get to the bottom of is at what point do you take them off the road? What's the accident rate related to seizing brakes? What would the information be that makes you think, wow, it's time to get this off the road until it's fixed?
I don't know the exact answer to that, what the number is. I don't have a number, but I'll certainly be exploring that very closely with Lime when we meet with them, which is my expectation will occur over the next 48 hours.
OK. Will you talk to us after you've had that conversation? We'd love to hear what comes out of it.
We will keep you informed.
Thank you. Really appreciate you joining us this evening. That is Dean Kimpton, who is with the Auckland Council on the Lyme issue there. Well, New Zealand is lining up to introduce a new tax on multinational companies making money out of online services in this country, such as Facebook, Uber and Instagram. The government says companies offering the likes of social media networks, trading platforms and online advertising earn a great deal of income from New Zealand consumers, but they are not paying their fair share of tax. It's released a discussion document examining options for how to update the tax system accordingly. It's estimated the new tax could raise between $30 and $80 million a year. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
What's being proposed is a digital services tax, generally charged at a flat rate of 2 to 3% on gross revenue. It would cover companies such as Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Airbnb and Uber. The OECD is working towards a regime bringing several countries together, but the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand wants to look at an interim measure.
As the global economy has become more digitised, tax systems have not kept up with these changes. This means that currently some digital companies can do significant business in New Zealand and other countries without being subject to paying tax on the income they earn. That is not fair and it is not sustainable.
She says New Zealand is not alone in looking at an interim tax.
This includes Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, the UK and the US. Today, Cabinet agreed to join them in investigating such a tax.
The Revenue Minister Stuart Nash says the current rules mean the odds are stacked in favour of overseas companies.
Compared to local companies who offer e-commerce, online advertising and social networking services. The value of cross-border digital services in New Zealand is estimated to be around $2.7 billion a year. And we're determined to ensure that multinational companies involved in this sector of the economy do pay their fair share of tax.
Ms Ardern was asked what New Zealand could do if multinationals just chose not to pay the tax.
As with all design policy for tax, these are things that you of course canvass in the design stages. It's fair to say there is a growing move. This was one of the issues discussed at Davos that you heard in the margins of the meetings. We are not alone in moving in this direction, and I think there's a general acceptance from those who are likely to be affected that it's time to step up.
The OECD and Australia have already released discussion documents for similar proposals. The New Zealand paper will be released by May, with it likely to be 2020 before any tax is actually introduced. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
On Checkpoint on RNZ National, the hunt for 1080 alternatives, and are parents claiming to homeschool their children but actually allowing them to bunk off? We'd love your feedback. Don't forget you can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, who's Susanna Leotawa with the news.
The government has signalled its determination to change the tax system so multinational companies pay their fair share. The Revenue Minister Stuart Nash says it's following the lead of other countries and consulting on a rate of 2 to 3% for multinational companies like Facebook, YouTube, Uber and eBay. Finance Minister Grant Robertson says the current tax rules also provide a competitive advantage to foreign digital services companies compared to New Zealand companies. The Prime Minister says this country is following the same process as Britain in considering Huawei's bid for involvement in the rollout of Spark's 5G network. The UK's National Cybersecurity Centre is reported to have decided it can mitigate the risks of using the Chinese company's equipment in its networks. New Zealand spy agency recommended rejecting a similar bid here unless Spark proved it could contain similar risks. One person is in hospital and 18 have been treated by paramedics following a chlorine spill at a school in Thames. Fire and Emergency says 5 crews were called to Parawai Primary School just before 3 o'clock this afternoon. St John Ambulance says 18 patients were treated for chemical exposure at the scene. WorkSafe says a missing door from a switchboard in the Pike River mine is unlikely to have been the cause of the explosion. Both the Minister for Re-entry and the opposition spokesperson agree there's probably a simple explanation for the door's whereabouts. WorkSafe spokesperson Tony Hetherington says computer modelling shows gas couldn't have reached the switchboard, so it's unlikely it was the ignition source. The agency never had custody of the electrical panel cover and has no knowledge of what happened to it. The Commerce Commission has hit a hurdle in its bid to sue the controversial ticket reseller Viagogo. It has been trying to get an interim injunction to stop the website from committing what it says are further breaches of the Fair Trading Act. But in a High Court judgment, Justice Courtney has dismissed the injunction request because Viagogo has not yet been formally served. Those are the headlines. Our next news and sport update is at 6.
And it's about 24 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. And Nona Peltier has joined me in the studio to talk business. Nona, the reporting season is upon us. So who have you got there to talk about? Tauranga Ports.
That's right. Yes. Well, okay. Now, look, that company spent, $350 million recently to dredge their harbour and so that they could take those big ships that a lot of ports can't take, including Auckland, would struggle. The Port of Auckland would not be able to necessarily take that on. But Tauranga can, and they have been, and it's helped lift their net profit up. It was $49 million. That's a bit more than they made the year earlier. And they are ordering another crane to take even more cargo there. And so, yeah, they've got a big outlook and seems to have been paying off for them, the expense that they went to.
They're winding up to take more capacity.
They sure are. And those ships are getting bigger, for sure. So it's come at the right time for them.
And Steel and Tube.
Yeah, Steel and Tube. Now, they've been in the news not so long ago. There was a fine imposed by the Commerce Commission, took a case against Steel and Tube over some of their steel mesh. Some of our listeners might recall that. Now, that case is still before the courts, and they've put that well behind them. They're moving ahead, so they've turned a corner, I think you could say, with cost cutting and increased sales, and that's helped to deliver a net profit for them for the 6 months ended December, $5.6 million, which is better than they got the year earlier, $3.8 million. And so their strategy for growth seems to be paying off for them, and the market certainly like that. It saw their share price rise 1 cent to $1.23, and also the port share price was up more than 1/3%, 2 cents up to $5.25. Interesting in our market, though, which was very little changed. Really, it's quite interesting because in Asia, the bulls are back. they've come back charging ahead, hoping, I think, possibly that there'll be a deal on China and the United States on trade. We'll see what happens there. Also, later this week, we're going to have some notes from the U.S. Federal Reserve on where they're heading with interest rates. People are expecting a much more dovish tone, and that's seen the markets rally just about everywhere. Our dollar certainly reflects that. We're sitting here at 68.8 US cents, 96.2 Australian, and 53.3 pence.
Thank you, Nona. Nona Peltier with your business news there. And the lawyer who represented some of the Pike River families during the Royal Commission hearings is disturbed that evidence from the mine appears to have gone missing. Queen's Counsel Nigel Hampton has no recollection of a photograph or any reports about a switchboard cabinet door that was recovered after the explosion in 2010. WorkSafe says the switchboard was unlikely the source of ignition, but one family member says it's bloody outrageous if evidence has gone missing and a proper investigation is needed. Here's our political reporter Jo Moyer.
Sonia Rockhouse, whose son Ben was among the 29 men killed in the mine blast, says authorities should urgently tell families what they know about the cabinet door.
I mean, there are people out there that know the answer to this question, and, I've said before, it's now time for those people to stand up and, because we're looking for truth and justice and accountability, and I think we are owed that.
Tony Hetherington, the head of High Hazards Energy and Public Safety at WorkSafe, says the agency never had custody of the electrical panel cover and has no knowledge of its whereabouts. He says computer modelling shows the gas could not have reached the switchboard, so it's not likely to have been the ignition source. But Nigel Hampton says the door could potentially be quite important, and he's concerned that he has no recollection of the photograph or any reports or comments about the door.
I don't recall seeing photographs of it during the lead up to and through the Royal Commission hearings, which is slightly disturbing.
Mr Hampton says the evidence could be a game changer for the investigation, but without it being forensically tested, that will never be known. He hopes there's an innocent explanation, but until it's found, the alternative is thinking the worst and most sinister conspiracy theory. The Minister for Pike River Re-entry, Andrew Little, says he became aware of the missing evidence last week, and the agencies involved in the original investigation were notified. Mr Little says they are still in the process of hunting it down. He says the evidence could be very informative, but he suspects there's a simple explanation for its disappearance.
The agencies investigating the original explosion in 2010 were the police and what was then the Department of Labour, now WorkSafe. I would be surprised if they don't have stored somewhere all of the exhibits and the material that they collected at that time as part of their investigation.
Mr Hampton hopes Mr Little is right.
I think there is sense in following what the Minister has said and allowing some proper amount of time to pass so that inquiries can be made and see if it can be located. One hopes it can be, then it can be examined. If it's not, then it adds a layer of disturbance.
The National Party's Pike River Re-entry spokesperson Mark Mitchell says he trusts the evidence was carefully collected and labelled at the time.
So I don't know if it is missing. I mean, we need to give the inquiry team and the police a chance to actually go back and, like I said, check back through that chain of evidence. Everything is normally scrupulously labelled and stored, so it may be stored somewhere. So they just need to have the time to sort that out.
The Prime Minister says the missing evidence seems to be a failure of the general handling of the scene at Pike River. Equipment being shipped from Australia that will be pivotal in re-entering the mine is expected to arrive any week now. Mr Mitchell says he hopes an invitation is extended to the opposition to be at the re-entry when it goes ahead in the next few weeks. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jo Moyer.
And just a hand on that story, the police have released a statement. This is from Assistant Commissioner Richard Chambers. It says the police are making inquiries into suggestions that an electrical cabinet from the Pike River mine went missing in the aftermath of the 2010 disaster. They say it will involve talking to relevant people involved as well as checking information held by the police relating to the original investigation, which concluded in 2013. They say they're aware of commentary around this item of equipment, but they're not able to speculate about its relevance evidence of this item or any others until they have completed their inquiries and have a full understanding of its significance or otherwise. They go on to say that they note that WorkSafe has today made significant comment on the item, which you just heard in that piece. And they are appealing to anyone with information which they believe is important and has not been considered by the police to come forward. They say now is the time to talk to us and tell us what you know. That from Assistant Commissioner Richard Chambers. The government has committed $19.5 million to find alternatives to 1080 poison in line with New Zealand First's opposition to the pesticide. There are still many opposed to the poison cereal pellets that are dropped into inaccessible bushland, some of whom left dead native birds on Parliament steps last year. And while Winston Peters says it's a necessary shift away from 1080, his colleague Shane Jones and Conservation Minister Jussie Sage say the new techniques won't fully replace it. Matthew Tunison reports.
The tui might be in song at Zealandia Wildlife Sanctuary in Karori, but they're still sadly absent from many parts of New Zealand. The aerial dropping of 1080 pellets to kill rats, possums and stoats remains the most common method for conserving native birds and plants. But despite widespread scientific consensus about its effectiveness, 1080 continues to have a strong legion of opponents. Shane Jones says the funding will give conservationists new ways of killing pests that don't attract the heated protests so common before a 1080 drop.
Unfortunately, that hysteria has not gone away, but the focus really here is strengthening the arm, quite frankly, of Minister Eugenie and her corps without fulfilling every prejudicial view that there is about 1080, but the reality is we need every trick in the book.
The money will come from the Provincial Growth Fund, which Mr Jones administers, and Jussie Sage says it'll be of great benefit to regional New Zealand.
Investing it in the surge regions means there'll be jobs. On Friday in Ruratoria, we were announcing a scheme, He Kau Rangatahi, to enable young people to get the skills in pest management, in nursery production, in te ao Māori and the reo, to actually be able to help with the restoration of the Waipu catchment.
Far from scaling back its 1080 operations, this year will actually see the largest ever aerial drop in New Zealand's history, due to the abundant food attracting an influx of pests.
This investment will help develop new technology, new traps, new lures, new toxins, and go to the places where we're seeing bird populations, our forests declining because of the scourge of possums, rats and stoats. So it's a real investment in the protection of things that Kiwis care about, our native species, our native forests.
Despite concerns raised by some MPs, including the Speaker of Parliament, Trevor Mallard, that Ms Sage was directing her department to avoid research into the role of genetic modification in pest control, Ms Sage says it's not on the table.
Well, we haven't reformed the legislation since the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification. The law is the law.
The National Party's conservation spokesperson, Sarah Dowie, says the government is failing to invest in research into what she called biotechnology.
That's the only way that we can truly achieve predator-free 2050.
But that's GM, right?
Well, we call it biotechnology. We want to have a mature discussion about it.
Can you give me an example of biotechnology?
Well, possums are for one, looking at creating sterility in possums, and that can be done through genome investigations.
New Zealand First leader Winston Peters said in a statement that the funding signals a necessary shift away from the use of 1080. He says his party maintains its opposition to 1080 and that with adequate resources, research and development into alternatives, it can be replaced. The new funds will be used by the Crown-owned company Predator Free 2050 Limited to contract pest eradication projects across tens of thousands of hectares. Atu i te whari parimata, mō te hōtaka o te ahi nei ko Matthew Tunison aho.
Reports from Syria say jihadists have blocked roads out of the last area held by Islamic State, preventing hundreds of civilians from leaving the region. Earlier, the US President Donald Trump urged European countries to take back and punish hundreds of captured foreign fighters. It's estimated 6,000 nationals from Western Europe travelled to Syria and Iraq to join Islamic State, which is now facing its final defeat on the ground. The BBC's Sean Hazzard reports.
This smoke is rising above the village of Baghouz, part of the last pocket of land still under the control of Islamic State. US airstrikes are providing the Syrian Democratic Forces with cover to advance on the area and clear out the remaining IS militants. Baghouz is largely a ghost town, but some civilians are still trapped inside. SDF fighters say they are cautiously going from house to house looking for militants who they say are using civilians as human shields.
Thanks
to the efforts of our colleagues, Islamic State is generally over. Only a small number of houses remain, which are homes to many people, including civilians, our detainees and IS militants.
With total victory in sight, attention is turning to what happens next. Earlier, in a series of tweets, the US President Donald Trump urged Britain, France, Germany and other European allies to take back over 800 IS fighters that were captured in Syria and to put them on trial. He said the caliphate was ready to fall, and if they didn't act, America would be forced to release the fighters, warning they would permeate Europe. Technically, it would not be the US who releases them. That will largely fall to the Kurdish authorities. But with American forces withdrawing, they will struggle to cope.
This is a big problematic issue because these prisoners, these ISIS fighters prisoners, are still pending here. Their countries, their European countries, refuse to take them back. And at the same time, the Kurdish authorities, they don't have that capacity or ability to do trials for them because the region here is not stable yet.
And while Islamic State might be facing military defeat, the legacy of its attempt to create a caliphate remains.
The US president talked about 800 fighters. It's not a matter of only 800 fighters. There are hundreds of their family members in Al-Hol camp in North Syria.
Accepting fighters and their families back creates security issues and is often unpopular. That's been underscored by the case of the British citizen Shamima Begum, who travelled to Syria to join the Islamic State group as a schoolgirl of 15 4 years ago. She now wants to return home, and a lawyer for her family says she has given birth to a baby boy in a Syrian refugee camp.
The family would like the UK government to accept its responsibility to a one-day-old UK citizen and have that baby repatriated to the UK where it's safe, hopefully with the issue of emergency travel documents.
Opinion in Britain is split on whether mother and son should be allowed to return, although the government has acknowledged it does have some responsibilities.
If you're dealing with a British citizen who wants to return to this country and they're not a dual citizen, so their only citizenship is British citizenship, then we are obliged at some stage at least to take them back. That doesn't mean that we can't put in place the necessary security measures to monitor their activities and make sure that they are not misbehaving.
With the campaign against Islamic State almost over, European governments will have no shortage of controversial cases to deal with.
That is Sean Hazard reporting there, and it's about 9 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keep your feedback coming. We're getting a lot of it in relation to the graffiti on the St John ambulances. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or flick us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But let's talk rugby for a moment. The former All Blacks winger, Julian Savea, is refusing to walk away from the French club Toulon despite damning criticism from the club owner. Mourad Boujalal told French media that Savea has been released and wasn't welcome at the club anymore. He said Savea should apologise and go home to New Zealand. The 28-year-old, who scored 46 tries in 54 All Black tests, has responded on social media saying that he's putting all the negativity behind him and he's heading into this week with a positive attitude. French-based rugby journalist Ian Borthwick has joined in the criticism and told RNZ rugby reporter Joe Porter that Savea has struggled to adapt in France.
I think it's fair to say that he struggled for form. He struggled really to have any impact at all on the pitch, and that was, I think, underlined by this. Well, not just him, but the whole team performance against Agen on the weekend, when really Julian had no impact at all on the game, despite getting a fair bit of ball, but despite them trying to bring him into the line. He just had no impact.
And he was obviously outdone by his opposite winger, which was quite a glaring display.
Well, his opposite winger was Benito Masilevu, and he's a Fijian, as you probably know. He hasn't played much this year. He was playing in second division last season.
But really he ran rings around Julian Savea, which was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as Mourad Boudjelal goes.
How bad has Savea been in France?
You saw maybe Boudjelal's comment that he thought he'd have to do a DNA test on him because he's not the same player he thought he was, the same player that he signed. And I think it's maybe the syndrome of players when they come to France having a lot of difficulty adapting to the culture and adapting to the style of rugby. But the pure fact is that Toulon are not doing well. And maybe this is that he's using Savea as a scapegoat for his own anger and his own frustration.
Yeah, and Savea has been playing out of position a little bit this season too. Could that have perhaps contributed?
Yeah, they have played him a lot at centre or in the 12 jersey, and that didn't work for him. But on the weekend he was playing on the right wing. They brought him in a lot to trying to bring him into the line and create breaches in the line in the middle of the field, but that didn't work either. And like the rest of the team, seemed a little lackadaisical and just lacking desire. Given what Boudjelal has said, it's hard to imagine him staying on there now, so the adventure may well be over.
That's RNZ rugby reporter Joe Porter speaking there with French-based rugby journalist Ian Borthwick. A Northland principal says some parents are falsely claiming they're homeschooling their children when they're simply allowing them to bunk off. Northland has the highest truancy rates in the country, and principals are urging the Ministry of Education to crack down and prosecute some parents as a deterrent to others. Lois Williams reports.
On any given day, about 20% of the pupils of Hora Hora Primary School in Whangarei are absent. That's about 80 children. And the principal, Pat Newman, says of those, up to 10% have no valid reason to be away.
Most of that's justified, but we have probably 10, 15 families in the school that no matter what we do, the children don't turn up.
Pat Newman says food, or the lack of it, used to be a reason for absenteeism, but not anymore. The school provides it, and money can be a factor if there's nothing in the kitty for transport. But he says all too often it's not that. He remembers one chronic truant who was at the school for just 20% of the time, over 5 years.
The family was well cared for, well fed, looked after. Mum's answer was we needed to pick them up because it was too far and too dangerous for them to walk, and we had no transport, so we provided raincoats, we provided all sorts, and basically I think it was that Mum just didn't want the kids to come to school.
Marilyn Dunn, the principal of Ruakaka Primary School, says some children are being kept off school for weeks or months at a time, and that's despite the best efforts of schools and truancy officers. The parents are claiming the kids are being homeschooled, but they don't register them as homeschoolers with the Ministry of Education as they're supposed to, and they quietly slip through the cracks.
There's a group of homeschoolers out there that are genuinely great, and they've got a genuine philosophy for why they're homeschooling, and they do it right. They go through the ministry, they register and everything, and that's fine. It's the other ones that get annoyed with the school and say, nah, we're not going to send them to school, and are able to sort of say they're homeschooling, but they don't register it. That's the group of kids that I worry about.
So whose job is it to check on the children who are homeschooled? Marilyn Dunn says the Education Review Office, ERO, has the authority, but from what she's seen, the bogus homeschoolers are getting away with it.
And they just keep saying that they're going to do homeschooling, they're going to be homeschooling. But once they're actually supposed to be homeschooling, there doesn't seem to be a system that checks on what's going on with those kids. You know, any children that are homeschooled, the Education Review Office used to check on them and everything, and I don't think that that's happening.
Pat Newman says the truancy problems reduced very slightly in the past 5 years, but it's taken huge resources to achieve a very minor improvement. He's urging the ministry to take a few of the repeat offender parents to court. Mr Newman says it might hurt the families, but they're hurting their children by limiting their life prospects.
I actually strongly believe we've got to the situation that we need to prosecute some families. Not that it will do any great good to the family, and I admit that, but it will signal a message to parents that, hey, at the end of the day, you are abusing your children and there are consequences.
The Ministry of Education says truancy prosecutions are taken as a last resort, and they're usually led by schools with ministry support. It says schools are better positioned to provide evidence and the ministry can reimburse the legal costs. But Pat Newman says it's unrealistic to expect schools to take on that job on top of everything else they're expected to do these days. And Marilyn Dunn says schools don't want to be taking parents to court because they have to maintain a positive relationship with whānau for the children's sake. RNZ has asked the ministry to comment on who's checking on the quality of homeschooling and how often, and also on whether it's the genuine article or just a blind for bunking school. In Whangarei for Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
Time now for some of your feedback. Let's go back to the story we ran earlier in the show, which is about the paramedics, ambulance paramedics, writing slogans on ambulances in liquid chalk. They're part of a protest over their pay negotiations. They issued a partial strike notice, so they're well within their rights to do this. But St John says it's costing them money, and people who have donated to St John and patients are distressed by this and have complained formally. This texter says, I donate to St John's and I'm not offended by the message on ambulances. I am offended that St John isn't funded properly and can't pay a decent wage. Another texter says if the donors really cared about the ambulance service, they would support their strike action. Abby in Auckland with this one. Ambulance service isn't even fully funded, fully supported by the government, despite it being an emergency service. Crazy, says Abby. And this from Shelley. Test the public opinion, Shelley says. I'm sure the general public support emergency services personnel being paid fairly for their great skills, especially when you need it the most, she says. Graffiti causing distress? What a load of rubbish. Grrr, says Shelley. It's informing the public. And Penny has texted us to say, look at the changes made to the Scottish system and start paying medics properly. They've saved huge amounts and have better outcomes by merging ambulance and helicopter services into a single national service. And finally, this one from Michael. What rubbish. Anyone in a state of distress is not going to notice the odd bit of signage on an ambulance. Time for the news now.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The government's getting the ball rolling on a digital services tax. The Revenue Minister Stuart Nash says it's following the lead of other countries and consulting on a rate of 2 to 3% for multinational companies like Facebook, YouTube, Uber and eBay. Such companies currently don't pay anything because they don't have a physical establishment in this country. Mr Nash says the tax will be an interim measure until the OECD comes to agreement on a long-term solution.
The value of cross-border digital services in New Zealand is estimated to be around $2.7 billion a year. And we're determined to ensure that multinational companies involved in this sector of the economy do pay their fair share of tax.
Stuart Nash says the estimated revenue from the new tax is between $30 and $80 million a year, but it depends on how the system is ultimately designed. WorkSafe says a missing door from a switchboard in the Pike River mine is unlikely to have been the ignition source of the explosion. Both the Minister for Re-entry and the opposition spokesperson agree there's probably a simple explanation for where the door is. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
WorkSafe's head of high hazards, Tony Hetherington, says computer modelling shows gas couldn't have reached the switchboard, so it's unlikely it was the ignition source. The agency never had custody of the electrical panel cover and has no knowledge of what happened to it. Families of the men who died in the disaster have just been made aware of a photograph of the door, which was blown 100 metres to the mine's surface, but mystery surrounds the whereabouts of the actual item. Nigel Hampton, who represented some of the families at the Royal Commission hearings, says he has no recollection of that particular piece of evidence. From Parliament, Joe Moyer.
The Prime Minister has gone on the offensive regarding New Zealand's relationship with China, responding to what she called inaccurate news stories that the relationship is under strain. Jacinda Ardern this afternoon denied that the Chinese government is warning tourists not to come to New Zealand. And she told her weekly post-cabinet media conference there are no problems with New Zealand exports at China's border.
Our officials in China have confirmed that New Zealand primary products continue to clear the border as usual. There is no indication of anything out of the ordinary in China's border clearance procedures for New Zealand products.
Jacinda Ardern. The National MP Mark Mitchell says he'll put politics aside while he's in China this week. Mr Mitchell, who is his party's justice spokesperson, flew to Hong Kong yesterday for a series of meetings with Chinese ministers, officials and company directors. He says it's a pre-organised, justice-focused trip, which he was invited on last July. National has been criticising the government's handling of the relationship with China, but Mr Mitchell says he won't be taking sides.
I'm very happy while I'm over here if we can help sort of strengthen that relationship and indicate how important it is to us.
The National MP Mark Mitchell. One person is in hospital and 18 people were treated by paramedics after a chlorine spill at a school in Thames this afternoon. Fire and Emergency says 5 crews were called to Parawai Primary School just before 3 o'clock. It says one person was taken to Thames Hospital. St John Ambulance says 18 patients were treated for chemical exposure at the scene. An Auckland man whose jaw was broken when the Lime scooter he was riding downhill suddenly stopped says the scooters need to be pulled from the streets until the problem is resolved. Many Lime users have reported the brakes seizing up unexpectedly. The company says it's investigating and has removed the affected scooters from use. But Liam Thompson, who was flung 10 metres when his one seized up last week, says he hasn't heard back from Lime since reporting the problem. He says he doesn't know how it is identifying the faulty scooters and he wants them all pulled until it can guarantee riders' safety. It's 4 minutes past 6. Strong wind in the Tasman fire zone has continued to prevent the last remaining evacuees from returning permanently to their homes. People from 80 properties in Teapot, Eves and Redwood valleys have not even had restricted access today. The authorities will reassess the situation in the morning. Meanwhile, the Hope Community Church has been buzzing with activity and a lot of food has been donated for the evacuees. Pastor Mark Fryer says people are tired and want to head home, but they're being resilient about it.
There's a lot of patience, I think, recognising that there's quite a major job to be done with, especially with the trees and the thermal hotspots that are happening. Those are slightly longer term issues.
Mark Fryer of the Hope Community Church. A Wellington engineer has been censured and fined for poor work on a crane attached to the back of a truck. Dick Joyce has been suspended from Engineering New Zealand, whose disciplinary committee upheld a complaint against him. He had certified the crane after it failed load testing, but another engineer questioned if the truck deck was rigid enough for the crane's size and position. The committee found Mr Joyce's work did not meet the standards expected of a chartered professional engineer and ordered him to pay a fine and costs totalling $15,000. Mr Joyce has already been suspended as a heavy vehicle certifier by the Transport Agency, which last year revoked some of his certifications of towing connections. To sport, and Crusaders coach Scott Robertson says re-signing with the side for the next 2 seasons doesn't mean he'll stop trying to be the next All Blacks coach. He's still keen to replace Steve Hansen and when Hansen steps down after this year's World Cup. Under New Zealand rugby policy, coaches aren't able to coach the All Blacks and a Super Rugby side at the same time, but Robertson has made it clear to the Crusaders he'll be applying for the top job later in the year, which could leave the defending Super Rugby champions looking for a new coach in 2020. Robertson says he had a few offers in front of him, but staying in Christchurch made sense.
I only got the currency converter out once to have a look. And the options overseas and just to weigh it all up. But in essence, if the job's available in the right time for me at the end of the year, I'll have a crack at it.
Scott Robertson. Meanwhile, All Blacks and Highlanders loose forward Liam Squire has announced he will head to Japan after the World Cup. The former Newcastle defender Stephen Taylor has signed with the Wellington Phoenix for a further season. He only joined the side this season and has appeared in all but one of its A-League games. 3 English Premier League clubs have safely negotiated their 5th round FA Cup ties against lower league clubs. Wolves beat Bristol City 1-0, Crystal Palace beat Doncaster 2-0 and Swansea trounced Brentford 4-1. And in Rugby League, the Sydney Roosters have claimed a record equalling 4th World Cup challenge title by beating Wigan 20 points to 8. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, our sports correspondent Peter Lamp has a case of code lag. I mean, is it the cricket season or the rugby season? Or both? There's a window on the world of America's Republican Party and its sometimes uneasy relationship with President Trump. And Nina Hall talks about a proposal to set New Zealand up as a base for conflict prevention. A Sweden or Switzerland of the South Seas. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, cloudy periods, isolated showers until evening and again from tomorrow afternoon. For the remainder of the North Island, fine weather apart from areas of morning and evening cloud. Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud tomorrow evening. Bulla, cloudy periods with a few showers from tomorrow afternoon. Westland and Fiordland, rain spreading north today with heavy falls and possible thunderstorms south of the glaciers from tonight. Canterbury, fine with high cloud increasing this afternoon and a few spots of rain in the south until tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, scattered light rain, more persistent for a time tomorrow morning, becoming widespread tomorrow evening with heavy falls possible in Southland. In Chatham Islands, a few showers developing this evening, possibly heavy with thunderstorms, clearing tomorrow but remaining cloudy. It's 8.5 minutes past 6.
And you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has announced that the computer services of the country's major political parties have been hit by a cyber attack. He updated the House of Representatives on the issue this morning, saying there was no evidence of electoral interference. Mr Morrison says Australia's cyber experts believe a sophisticated state actor is responsible for the attack, but he wouldn't say which country it was. The ABC's Tom Iggulden has more.
What seems to be the target here is the amounts of data that political parties have, obviously, on the voting preferences, etc., of many people could be the target of this attack. Political parties, as we know, collect this kind of data, and that appears to have been the target of this particular hack. The Prime Minister said that just as businesses and homes around the nation need to keep their cybersecurity up to date, so too do political parties. There is a bit of a vulnerability here in that they're not always run to the highest of standards. Political parties, as we know, often struggle operationally in these sorts of areas, as do many small businesses, for example. So a timely reminder, says the Prime Minister, but also a critical one, given the fact that, people need to have confidence, says the Prime Minister, in the proper functioning of democracy.
During the course of this work, we also became aware that the networks of some political parties, Liberal, Labor and Nationals, have also been affected. Our security agencies have detected this activity and acted decisively to confront it. They are securing these systems and protecting users. Now, I do not propose to go into the detail of these operational matters, but our cyber experts believe that a sophisticated state actor is responsible for this malicious activity.
So people might remember that a few weeks ago it was revealed that the Parliament House IT system had been hacked, and it was during the course of the Australian Cybersecurity Agency's investigation into that hack that this latest hack into the political parties was uncovered. So a worrying chain of events, I think you'd have to say, has been uncovered here, and something that both the Prime Minister and also the opposition leader Bill Shorten made a statement were at pains to say has happened all over the world. They referenced Japan, Canada, the US, obviously, and a number of other countries that had been the subject of malicious state actor-sponsored hacks. Australia, it seems, is now added to that list as well.
And that was Tom Iggulden in Canberra. As the terrorist group Islamic State makes its last stand in eastern Syria, the focus is turning to what happens next. IS has attracted hundreds of foreign fighters from across the Muslim world and even from the nations in the EU. The issue of returning foreign fighters will need to be dealt with, and also of their families. The issue's been brought into sharp focus by a British teenager who ran away to join Islamic State 4 years ago. Shamima Begum was found heavily pregnant in a refugee camp last week. She's now given birth to a baby boy and also given a second interview in which she repeated her plea to return to the UK. Here's the BBC's Daniel Sandford.
Shamima Begum appears to have given her second interview just hours after giving birth to her third child. She said the other two died of hunger and malnutrition in the last few months as the Islamic State group lost control of almost all its territory in Syria. She described how in recent weeks she'd been starving and sleeping outside.
I think a lot of people should have sympathy towards me for everything I've been through. When I didn't know what I was getting into when I left, and I just was hoping that maybe for me, for the sake of me and my child, they let me come back. They don't have any evidence against me doing anything dangerous. When I went to Syria, I was just a housewife.
She told the Sky News reporter that she'd had no regrets about joining IS because otherwise she wouldn't have met her husband, who was an IS fighter. She said she was okay with the beheadings because she understood they were allowed under Islam. The Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, has said that he will try to prevent people who went to join terrorist organisations returning to the UK, but acknowledged that citizens could not be made stateless. Mohammed Tasnim Akunji, the lawyer acting for Shamima Begum's family, said that the government needed to remember that she was 15 years old when she left Britain and she's just given birth.
We're talking about a newborn baby who poses no risk or threat to anybody, not even cognizant, and yet he's talking about a child who's a British citizen in terms of a security threat, and that, frankly, to my mind, is sick.
The Culture Secretary, Jeremy Wright QC, who was Attorney General until last year, conceded today that if Shamima Begum managed to get to safety, then the UK would have to let her come back.
If you're dealing with a British citizen who wants to return to this country and they're not a dual citizen, so their only citizenship is British citizenship, then we are obliged at some stage at least to take them back. That doesn't mean that we can't put in place the necessary security measures to monitor their activities and make sure that they are not misbehaving. It doesn't mean either that we can't seek to hold them to account for their behaviour thus far.
The government says 900 people from the UK travelled to the conflict in Syria, and while more than half have either returned or been killed, almost 400 are not yet accounted for. President Donald Trump said today that the United States is asking Britain and other European countries to take back their citizens who fought for IS and put them on trial. He said that otherwise they could be released from captivity in northern Syria and might then permeate Europe.
Māori leaders are calling for heads to roll after a corrections working group on countering violent extremism identified Māori nationalist groups as a potential threat to the public. The department has admitted the group set up to review potential extremist threats couldn't actually identify any Māori nationalist groups, and any potential threats are so small they can't measure them. Miriana Johnson reports.
The Countering Violent Extremism Working Group identified Māori nationalist groups as potential threats, alongside jihad, far-right groups and groups who undertake violent action. It's headed by Ray Van Beynen, and minutes from a meeting held 2 years ago show no further mention of Māori nationalist groups. Matthew Tukaki from the Māori Council is furious and wants someone held accountable.
If you're going to make these sorts of comments, of these sorts of aspersions over an entire race of people and the organisations that represent them, and you have been found wanting, you should not be a public servant, you should be fired.
That's echoed by former Māori Party co-leader and Whanganui District Health Board member Tariana Turia, who says the comments are deliberately divisive.
The truth of it is that this person is speaking from a significant position of power. And if this is untrue, they definitely should be sacked.
She says despite all her years in politics, she's never heard of any Māori nationalist groups.
I am absolutely appalled because at the end of the day, none of us know if any of that is true. And if we don't know, those of us who are on the ground, and believe you me, I am on the ground, if we're not hearing that, where do they get their information from?
Mr Tukaki believes it is not an isolated case and is yet another example of racism within the public service.
It's not just this one case. You know, the example of MBIE sending in private investigators to spy on iwi and hapu organisations is yet another example. I mean, this is a growing trend within the public service of trying to put the finger on Māori organisations as somehow being troublesome and troublemaking.
The Corrections Minister, Calvin Davis, says he's disappointed by the comments and has made his views clear to Corrections. But he doesn't think Mr Beynen should be fired for a one-off comment.
I don't think somebody should be fired for, making an ill-advised comment. I'm certain that it's not going to happen again. Corrections know that that's the way this government thinks.
He says he'll be talking to Corrections about the group's purpose, but says it is a very minor part of the department's work. But if it is not fit for purpose, he isn't ruling out scrapping it. In a statement, Corrections says the comment was inappropriate and it apologises for any unintended offence caused. For Checkpoint, ko Miriana Johnson tēnei.
Lawyers for the US actor Jussie Smollett, who starred in the TV series Empire, have denied he had any role in an assault last month that he alleges was carried out by two white men. The statement came after sources told US media that the police believe Smollett may have paid two Nigerian brothers to stage the attack. The brothers, who worked as extras on Empire, have now been questioned by Chicago police, who now say that the trajectory of the investigation has shifted. CNN's Victor Blackwell has more.
Two law enforcement sources with knowledge of the investigation tell CNN that Chicago police believe actor Jussie Smollett paid two men to orchestrate an assault on him that he reported late last month, an allegation Smollett denies. The men, who are brothers, were arrested Wednesday but released without charges Friday after Chicago police cited the discovery of new evidence. The sources told CNN the two men are now cooperating fully with law enforcement.
Innocence prevailed, all right? My guys are walking home. They're not charged. They are not suspects in this case.
Smollett told authorities he was attacked in late January by two men who were yelling out racial and homophobic slurs. He said one attacker put a rope around his neck and poured an unknown chemical substance on him.
I noticed the rope around my neck and I started screaming. And I said, "There's a rope around my neck."
The sources told CNN there are records that show the two brothers purchased the rope found around Smollett's neck at a hardware store in Chicago. In a statement to CNN, Smollett's attorneys wrote, "As a victim of a hate crime who has cooperated with the police investigation, Jussie Smollett is angered and devastated by recent reports that the perpetrators are individuals he is familiar with. He has now been further victimized by claims attributed to these alleged perpetrators that Jussie played a role in his own attack. Nothing is further from the truth, and anyone claiming otherwise is lying." Smollett claims his attackers referenced President Trump's "Make America Great Again" slogan.
And I see the attacker masked, and he said, "This MAGA country," punches me right in the face. So I punched his back. And then we started tussling. You know, it was very icy.
But he refutes reports that he told police the attackers wore MAGA hats.
I didn't need to add anything like that. They called me a. They called me a. There's no which way you cut it. I don't need some MAGA hat as the cherry on top of some racist sundae.
And during the same ABC News interview, he expressed frustration about not being believed.
It feels like if I had said it was a Muslim or a Mexican or someone black, I feel like the doubters would have supported me a lot more. And that says a lot about the place that we are in our country right now.
Victor Blackwell reporting there. And let's go to politics now. Another key political poll has delivered more bad news for National and Simon Bridges. The One News Colmar Brunton poll has National falling 4 points since November to 42% support, with Labour up to at 45%. In the preferred Prime Minister stakes, Jacinda Ardern is up 5 points at 44%, and Simon Bridges has dipped 1 point to 6% support. That's the lowest level of support since he became National's leader, and level pegging with his MP Judith Collins. Political scientist Bryce Edwards has been looking at the poll and joins me now. Hi Bryce, does two polls make a trend?
It does, because this poll does confirm that that News Hub poll that was quite frightening for National was generally true, that it wasn't some sort of aberration. So I think this has to be seen as a bad poll for National, but it's not as bad as that News Hub one. Really, the movements aren't as steep in decline for National as that one. So I think Bridges will still be taking something good from this, that he's seen worse polls, I guess.
So two polls, as you say, would indicate a trend. You said that Simon Bridges would be taking some solace in the fact that these numbers aren't as bad, but should he be looking over his shoulder nonetheless?
Well, we see that Judith Collins is, yes, on the same amount of support, 6%. Again, once from this poll we can see that she's the definite replacement if he is gone. If he does go, she's the one that everyone has identified as the next best thing, really. So, yes, he is in trouble in terms of that. I mean, it's not as bad as that last poll having her ahead of him, But it does show that, she's the big rival to watch.
But would anyone really want that job? If the numbers are going downward in the National Party, would anyone in their right mind want to make a sprint for the leadership before 2020 on that basis?
Well, it's just hard to know at this stage. It used to be the assumption that if you wanted to be leader, you needed to take over early in the parliamentary term so that you'd have enough time to be able to, get your name out there and, get your track record sorted. But we saw with Jacinda Ardern taking over the Labour Party 7 weeks before the last election that has just turned that thinking on its head. So yes, I think Judith Collins, if she does want to be leader, and I think she does, let's be honest, I think she will be in no rush, and she will want to give Simon Bridges enough time to basically, do the right thing by leaving, if that's what, if he can't get those numbers up. But she'll want to take over when the polls have dropped national probably a bit further so that she can then turn them around.
Does it matter what the leader of the opposition polls as preferred Prime Minister? Because the public does not elect the leader of a party. They elect a party to govern, and the decision on who leads it is up to the party. So does it really matter?
Yeah, I think it matters a lot because it really is what the public are interested in. When they think of the government, they think of Jacinda Ardern. When they think of the opposition, they need to be able to have someone in their mind that they think, I like that person and I'm willing to trust them as Prime Minister. I'm willing to therefore vote National. And at the moment, they just don't seem to have that. So it really is, yes, it's kind of presidentialised politics, and maybe it shouldn't be like that, but the reality is that we do vote on the basis of who we want to be Prime Minister.
So 42% National Party sitting on, according to this One News Colmar Brunton poll. Where's the danger zone in terms of that party vote where you see people starting to shuffle, move and plot? Is it once you lose the 4 at the front of the figures?
Oh, that 40 is a psychological threshold, yes, that once they go below that, I wouldn't say that, if one poll goes below that it will be game on, but certainly if there was more than one, then I think Simon Bridges would be in a huge amount of trouble. Yeah, he'll be quite happy that it's 42 rather than 38. But, people also have to look at how the minor parties are going. And, New Zealand First, again, they are a key part in having this coalition, the current coalition in power, and they, again, have dropped in this poll down to 3%. So, again, National and Bridges will be wanting to focus on that and take some solace out of the coalition not doing so well amongst support partners.
But the Greens are up compared to the TV3 poll, yeah? So they were, I think, just over 5%, weren't they, in the TV3 poll? They're 6% on this one. So how will they feel about that?
I think the Greens are worried at the moment in general, especially because that last poll had them only on 5.1%, and that is too close to the threshold. I would say 6% is too close to the threshold. And although there's a bit of a assumption that minor parties do well in the election year, and they tend to do better than the polls they receive in these other years, and that's no longer really the truth. In the last few elections, we've actually seen minor parties do worse during the campaign, and that includes the Greens. So I think, the Greens will be quite worried, it's still being only at 6%.
Good to talk to you. That is political scientist Bryce Edwards, who has been looking at that latest political poll, the One News Colmar Brunton poll, which has, Simon Bridges down to 6% support for preferred Prime Minister, neck and neck with Judith Collins. One of the world's most powerful non-nuclear ships has arrived in Wellington for the first time after an ice-breaking mission to Antarctica. It is the third time the US Coast Guard cutter, Polar Star, has visited New Zealand, but this time she bypassed Lyttelton and came to Wellington. The trip is part of an annual mission known as Operation Deep Freeze to ensure much-needed supplies get through to Antarctica's Scott Base and McMurdo Station. Charlotte Cook went on board to take a look.
Inside the US Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, Captain Gregory Stanslick is imitating the sound of the ceiling rattling, the sound that echoes through the ship as it breaks through ice. He describes how the whole ship shakes as the wide rugby ball-shaped bow breaks through ice up to 3 metres thick. Crew on board the ice cutter describe the shaking and sounds like an earthquake as the ship jolts from port to starboard and cracks the ice below them. The ship travels from Seattle to Antarctica once a year, cutting through the ice, creating a channel for cargo and fuel vessels to follow behind, delivering supplies to science programs on Scott Base and McMurdo Station. Captain Stan Slick explains how a technique called backing and ramming is used to break the ice, where the ship rises on top and then reverses and drives back into the ice like a sledgehammer.
The whole technique of ice breaking is riding up on the ice and using the displacement of the ship to actually crack it. And then as the shape of the bow is much like a rugby ball, it actually guides the ice that we break.
Captain Stan Slick says the ice then scrapes past the ship, hitting the propellers, creating a frozen margarita-like slushy for the other vessels to follow behind. When cutting ice, the Polar Star travels at a slow 5 knots an hour, covering just 1.6 kilometres a day. Operations Manager Karen Kutkowitz says the ship's mission is vital.
80% of all of the containers that go to Antarctica go on the ships that we clear the path for in order for them to get to the ice pier.
This trip was to guide a single cargo ship, and it's on its way home now with 150 people on board. It's been 46 days since many of the crew set foot on shore, so they're off exploring what the capital has to offer. Assistant Operations Officer Samuel Krakauer is looking forward to life's simple pleasures.
I'm a big sports nut, so I don't get to watch sports as much. We don't necessarily have TV all the time, especially down south. There's no satellites, so I don't get to watch all the games I want to see.
For others, it's fresh food like orange juice, salad and eggs. The crew will have a few days to get their fix of cravings before heading back to their home port, Seattle. For Checkpoint, this is Charlotte Cook.
And just enough time for some of your feedback. We had a story from Liam, who was bucked off a Lime scooter, he believes, because of a braking fault. There are a lot of feedback on this story. Michael of Masterton says, Lime is like Jetstar. When things go wrong, it is never in your favour. Tom says, imagine the outcome if Liam had hurried off his scooter onto a toddler on the footpath. And this one, read the scooter malfunction. This is why ACC must go. No incentive by companies to be held responsible and pay for their negligence, that person says. And Joe has got in touch. Also, he says the fastest way for Lime to respond is to remove their licence to operate. Until then, all that will be given is assurances that they have the situation under control and they'll keep on earning and injuring. And this last one from Penny, why aren't ACC and LTSA proactive on Lime scooter regulations? Other countries have dealt with this. They should be concerned at accident costs on behalf and not leave it to individual councils to resolve. Thank you very much for all your feedback this evening. You can catch up with some of our stories online and we'll be back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The government estimates a tax on multinationals such as Facebook and YouTube would bring in $30 and $80 million a year. The Labour Party has passed National in the latest Colmar-Brunton political poll, rising 2 points to 45%, while National is down 4 to 42%. Jacinda Ardern says, contrary to media reports, this country has a good relationship with China and there are no problems for New Zealand exports at the Chinese border. And the High Court has ruled against the Commerce Commission issuing a temporary injunction to stop Viagogo trading as it prepares to sue the Swiss ticket reseller. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7. Trending now, coming up.
RNZ National, with a fresh take on the day's news at 10 every weeknight with Karen Hay.
Left as it is, New Zealand will cease to really matter to China.
Including the latest national and international news